I want to introduce our next speaker, which is Harry Hochheiser. And Harry is faculty at the University of Pittsburgh, Department of Biomedical Informatics, and he works on human-computer interaction and has been doing a little bit of work on annotation usability.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Wendy. It's fascinating to be here because this is largely out of my field. My deep experience in NLP and annotation goes back almost to January. So my perspective here will be somewhat as an outsider, and I'm going to try to talk a little bit about what I have seen in looking at annotation processes and tools from the perspective of somebody who looks at usability and talks about what makes tools usable and how we can improve them. And I want to think about how we can improve the process of annotation so that in those times when we have humans in the loop, that we can do things more effectively. So why is the usability important? I think this is something we don't need to spend a lot of time on. Really, of course, the point being that we want to increase quality and reduce cost as much as possible. Those things, of course, being interesting questions on their own, because as we heard a couple of speakers earlier this morning say, what quality level do we need? What time are we willing to spend? These are not going to be absolutes, but I think the general goal is saying that if we can reduce the cost, we're all going to be better off. So why is it hard is the first question I start with then. Well, we've been looking at this in the context of the SHARP and looking at annotating clinical text with disease, disorders, and relations, and you see that we've got a lot of things going on here. The annotator has got to look at the text, has got to look at the annotations they're creating, bringing in some experience that they have, often with the folks that we've been dealing with from professional work in this field of medical annotation. They have to bring in guidelines, as we've discussed, and they have to, at least in the case that we're looking at, bring in the external resources, specifically annotating disorders with SNOMED CUIs. You have a lot of cognitive demand here. The texts aren't simple. The guidelines aren't simple. The experience is pretty useful, particularly in terms of things like the interpretation of temporal relations, which I'm not going to say a lot about here, but as you'll see a little bit, just even knowing which of the different SNOMED terms to use to match up with one of the terms in your text requires some experience and some perspective that wouldn't be obvious or given, and yet does involve some cognitive effort. So I want to be fairly clear about what I mean when I talk about usability. And so I'm going to do this from the perspective of the kind of thing that I just did a week or two ago in my human-computer interaction class. So what do I mean by this? So something is usable if it's efficient. Usually we talk about task completion time. Learnable. People don't read manuals. We don't have to have people go through extensive training before they can do a tool. So anything that can be learned as quickly and easily as possible is something we think of as being usable. And again, this is a metric that we can study. Something like annotation, I wouldn't necessarily expect that you're going to get somebody to walk up off the street and use it just the same way as you would, say, an information kiosk at a museum. But we'd like to keep the overhead of training people to something that's reasonable. Memorability, this is a different take on learnability, saying that, well, how do I retain what I've learned? How do I manage to use the infrequently used sequences of actions or controls? How do I do this over time so I don't have to relearn things again and again? Error handling and prevention. These are two sides of the same coin. The best way to handle an error is to prevent it. We'd like to make sure people don't make mistakes, and we have interfaces that channel people towards doing, quote, the right thing. And in the cases where there is a mistake, that we can make sure the user knows about it when we can tell that, or that something can be undone, revert back to the previous state. Something that will help somebody understand what went wrong when there was an error, so that they have a better chance of avoiding that error, avoiding some bad circumstance. So, the big red button on the annotation tool that says delete all annotations is probably not a good idea, especially if it doesn't have an undo associated with it. So again, you get rid of that button, you prevent an error, you give the undo to allow somebody to recover from it. Satisfaction. This is subjective. There are dozens of different instruments that have been developed over the years to ask people their feelings about various interfaces on Likert scales. Obviously, it's a little bit harder to get at this as being the subjective measure, but I'll argue even for the case where you're hiring professionals, if you're asking somebody to do a volume of annotation work, the more that they enjoy the tool, the more they think that it meets their needs, the higher quality you may get in the end. We don't want to force people to go through hoops that they shouldn't have to go through to make it unpleasant for them to work with the tool. It's not a good sign for output. So what are the factors that involve this? I mentioned this beforehand. Cognition, I think there's a big issue in annotation. The load that we're put on somebody's mind to remember what's going on, to what they have to attend to, what they have to understand and learn. We don't want to overtax people's minds. Even in the case where we expect people to have domain expertise and to be motivated to do the work, if we make them do extra mental work, we can think that we're going to likely have more errors, slower work, more frustration. We'll see examples of this in a little bit. Perception, again, what do you see? How to interpret it? We want to make sure that people find all the terms they need to annotate. How do we make sure we do that? Motor abilities. This gets to interacting with the screen and the mouse. You want to slow somebody down, make them go back and forth between different on-screen targets that are very far away from each other. Lay out your interfaces in a way that makes sense in terms of the sequences so you don't have to do a lot of gyrations just to get things done. Again, that'll come up in a little bit as well. And then we look at what we can do about these things to help minimize the load. We can talk about mappings, meaning how do you display what can happen in terms of visibility and make the results of your actions tie into the actions themselves. How we can give people feedback to talk about the state of the system. How can we support the construction of accurate mental models that really allow somebody to make sure that the way they're thinking about the tool and the process is consistent with what the software is doing. Because as soon as you get a divergence there, things can really go off the rails. I always think of usability as a contextualized relationship. And the point here is to say that we need to think about a user and a tool and a task to talk about what it means for something to be usable. The right tool for the wrong task will not be usable. The wrong user with the right tool and the right task will have poor usability outcomes. And of course, mismatches between the tool and the task will be problems. All of these things need to align well to have usability. And this is one of these things that is all too often forgotten. But in a world of biomedical informatics where we talk about things like EMRs, we have to continually remind ourselves that usability is not a constant, but a contextualized outcome. So how do we go about understanding these things? So there's a lot of work in human-computer interaction. The place I'll cut to on the quick is this notion of contextual inquiry, where we try to study a problem by observing people and do a lot of work that is really qualitative analysis of a situation. And what we will then do is to use that to understand what are the opportunities and problems to solve to improve a process, to build a better interface. How do we meet users' needs more effectively? We can then go ahead and try to prioritize those needs. We'll talk about that a little bit today. A little bit of modeling, perhaps, to predict what benefits which interface designs might have, and implementation. And then I'm a big believer in the end of the user study. Let's not just claim that our interface is better, but let's show it in a controlled fashion. And particularly in this work, we've been trying to do both the process of looking at short-term improvements that we can make to existing tools, and really what I consider to be the longer-term goal would be to do work redesign. So what happens if you throw out completely throw out the current model of annotation tools and you start from scratch, what would you end up with? Would you end up with something radically different from what's out there right now? I don't know. But I think if we ask that question, we can go find some interesting opportunities. So the process here, my screen, I'm losing the slide, sorry about that. So we're looking at disease disorder annotation. I have a set of guidelines. This is basically, for the most part here, and I'm probably going to get this wrong because I'm not an expert on the guidelines, but it's which diseases are mentioned in the clinical record, thank you, and where in the body are these conditions found. I did some work earlier this year with a couple of sessions with some expert medical annotators. And in the contextual inquiry model, this is, as I said, a very well-established kind of thing, but basically what it boils down to, in a nutshell, is to say that we put people in front of the work that they do using the tools that they would use, and we ask them to explain what are they doing and how and why, as if they were the master teaching a novice how to do this work. And then, as the interviewer, I will butt in, I will ask questions, I will attempt to clarify, I will make suggestions, well, what about this, or why do you do that? Excuse me. And the goal is really to develop an understanding that can inform building models of the work and how it might be reimagined or redesigned or improved. Something that we did with this project that was an interesting departure for me was to do this not in person, which is what would be my preference, but via a WebEx, which is an online web conferencing tool that supports both audio and screen display. And it was a nice way to work with the folks who are not located where I was. In person, I would do things like looking at how does somebody have their desktop arranged? What is on their desk around their computer? What artifacts do they use that are not specifically part of the software system? How do they arrange their computers and their monitors and their mouse and keyboard? I did not get that information here, but I think what we did get was a lot that provided a lot of insight. So this is a nice model for things that can be done when you're not co-located with your subjects. Again, 2 one-hour sessions. I'm being a bit repetitive there. So what I'm going to do in a second here is to show the example of what went on. What I didn't say before that is relevant is that these folks are using the Notator plugin to Protege 3.1 to do this. And what I'm going to do is to play a little clip from the video that we had, just so you can get a little bit of an idea of what kind of conversation goes on and how we go about this. And I'll talk about some of the insights we got from this process and the conclusions that it led us to. So let's see if I can make this play now. So we tried this before the audio was...
Got it.
So this is a subset here.
All right, we got that one done. So next one is shortness of breath.
Okay.
And again, shortness of breath really is dyspnea.
Okay. And that's just something you know because you know this work. You've done it.
Right.
You've done it from experience.
Yeah. And usually if you scroll down a little bit, you'll
I see.
see like shortness of breath. It kind of falls in there for a different source, but it's really all the same. And it's medical terminology.
Yep. Do you ever look at the report view or the raw view in that window?
No.
Okay.
Never
Great.
had really looked at it. Stop. Okay.
Okay.
So now I'm going to make this my disease disorder. Next one. I just copy my code, throw it in there, and it's done.
Okay. Now, something like this, okay. Are you done with that set of text, I guess, is the thing I would want to...
Okay, so this can go on for quite a while, and if anybody wants to hear more of it, I can play it for you later. I hope you got a feel, at least, for how it asked these questions to understand what they were doing. And again, you look at the UMLS window, and there are all these other displays. There's a lot of other information there. You may have noticed that when he did the search, there were about 4 other things that came up for shortness of breath. at another time in that same recording, I asked, well, why did you pick that one as opposed to one of the others? And I actually don't recall what the answer was, but there was a reason for that. But clearly you can see the expertise that this was somebody who really knew the UMLS terminology and knew what they were looking for there. Just didn't happen to know the term. The other thing that I hope was fairly obvious from that was that this little operation of assigning the code to the span of the annotation was something that ended up being a fair amount of overhead that was not necessarily terribly efficient. Now, what I did not do there was to find out exactly how long it would take. I didn't time somebody doing that, and of course the fact that I'm asking questions makes any timing of that particular span somewhat invalid. But I think we can see some inefficiency in the process there. Now, before we go ahead, I want to do some caveats here. Instead of the end of the paper, I'll say it right in the middle of the talk. The limitations, you want to ask yourself questions about validity. If I do this with 2 people for 1 hour each, how generalizable are my concerns here? I would like to do more of these interviews, of course, but you get the usual problems of trying to get times from people. And what I'm going to claim, and I'm definitely interested in discussing this, and I think I can defend it, is to say that even though I've got a very small number of observations, I have some results that can be generalizable, at least in terms of identifying opportunities. Remember, this is not about statistically characterizing something so much as finding problems and identifying opportunities that could merit from further exploration. So we want to be reasonably rigorous, but we don't have to be statistically rigorous. So what are the themes that came out here? From this, the coding of these 2 sessions, we came up with about 20 different suggested revisions, many of which had to do with the process. The guidelines had really suggested multiple pass annotations, first going through and doing the different annotations and then making the second pass for the relations, which is fine. The question is to whether that was as efficient as another approach to something that could be tested, that we didn't really get into this. They didn't really use the annotation manual at all. The participants we talked to said they would have the manual nearby or they might have it on their desk, but they relatively rarely looked at it. They claimed that they had more or less internalized it and they know what they were looking for. The system didn't give them very much feedback regarding mistakes. Annotations were usually within single sentences, which I don't remember offhand whether that was specified in the guidelines. Yes, okay, I'm getting nods from Wendy or Gergana. Obviously, that may not always be the case. The spans and how they're displayed, particularly with spanless annotations, was somewhat difficult, and this is a limitation of the notator tool. This came up particularly with something like shortness of breath, which is a disease disorder, but also has the physical location of breath, and you have to annotate, have the term relate to itself, and Notator doesn't display that very well. Closely related, the color coding of annotations was a little bit overloaded and hard to interpret. Things got very busy very quickly. The domain knowledge impacts the use of the semantics. I think the fact that these folks knew their medical records very well it had a definite influence on how they used the CUI codes, how they interpreted things. And this led to this possibility that there was some implicit work going on that led me, again, think about this, how well their practice was actually aligned with the guidelines. And this is something I'll come back to, but they talked about what it meant to infer a timing relationship. And there was at least one discussion that we had where they said, well, we do it this way, and then the comment came up, well, the guidelines say they're not supposed to do that. And this is, of course, a concern we'd like to figure out a way to address. And something that the agreement or the kappas and the alphas won't get at. So the annotation of the CUI span was probably the most high priority thing we came up with as something that we could improve potentially. We saw a few other things in terms of adjudication. I'm just going to mention these as findings. We didn't really spend a lot of time talking about the adjudication process. My hunch is that's something that could have a lot of work done in its own right. But I just want to go through here very quickly the steps that are involved in annotating a span with the CUI. And that's an awful lot. And I don't know how many spans you'd have to annotate in your typical medical record. But I'm going to claim here that the overhead could easily add up, and particularly when you talk about switching between two different operating systems windows and copying and pasting, the errors, the opportunities there are significant. And it's a process that I think could use a lot of improvement. So how do we get at this? Well, before we build the user interface to test out the improvement here, we can do a little bit of predictive modeling to see if what we think might happen with a change in the interface. So based on work in cognition and human motor abilities and understanding, going back to things like Fitts' law, we can predict how long is it going to take if I take a task and turn it into a series of mouse moves and button presses and clicks and text type. I can predict, and even adding in think time. This goes back to the early 80s where Stu Card and his group did the GOM system, and then there's the computational cognitive architecture of ACT-R that adds on to this. More recently, Bonnie John and her group at CMU have built something called CogTool, which really, to my mind, revolutionizes this work, because essentially what they've done is to create a drag and drop GUI tool that allows you to build models of interfaces and to see what the predictions would be like, and all of the details of the predictive models are wrapped up in the tool, so you don't have to know what you're doing. Other than, of course, to use it correctly. So we took a look at this, and here's just a screenshot, and I don't expect you to see all the details here, but basically what you do is you tie together the interfaces so that the screen state is captured in each of the images here, and you connect them to show the sequence, and then over here you can have the actions that lead you to your time predictions. And now these can be real screenshots. Most of these are built off of either Notator or the web browser using UMLS, but there's nothing that requires that. You could draw a bunch of boxes and diagrams in a low fidelity prototype of a screen just as easily to come up with your prediction. So what I looked at was to compare the current implementation and the current system with a couple of other possibilities. One would be to say we have a pre-annotation where you just had to confirm the CUI code. Another one which would be needed with that would be to say, well, what happens if you're pre-annotating it's wrong and I've got to do a search anyway? So assume you confirm and do a search that's based on the text that the system thought was pre-annotated. And then maybe if I just start off by saying, here I've selected a term and I want to do a contextualized search with the integrated UMLS. So there's no pre-annotation. So which is better? So here you might have the example of where a bunch of terms are suggested. I didn't like any of those, so I hit other and I type something else, and a few other possibilities come up. So this would be the correction case. And again, in my models, I include each of the actions. So I select this term, then this pops up, and I click other, and I type something there, and I press OK, and then I scroll down there, and that's how I do it. So what do I get? The current tool predict about 25% of the 25 seconds. If we just pre-annotate, we have a confirmation. Could be as low as 5 seconds. If we have to correct an incorrect kind of thing, it's 15 seconds. A contextual search with no pre-annotation, 13.3 seconds. So the punchline here that even if I have a high error rate, I might do better with pre-annotation. And the key word in that sentence is might. This is all predictive, which means it's worth the paper it's printed on. The only thing that I really take out of this is a sanity check to say, does this seem like a good idea? I don't believe it until I actually see it worked out. And by worked out, I mean implemented and tested in a controlled user study. Because as we've heard a little bit here, you know, these pesky humans will screw things up all the time if you let them. So this is at least a starting point. And the beauty of this is that we can do this relatively easily. This is like a day's worth of work to come up with this. And I'd at least like to have this to make sure that it seemed like a vaguely sensible thing to do before I put a lot of software engineering time to build it out. So can we do some other things with pre-annotation? Well, what can we do here other than just picking out terms? You know, do we want to do just POS annotation? Do we want to do a full seat takes kind of thing where we annotate every possible term? We could do a lot of different variants here. The possibilities for experimentation with different designs to see what is the most usable, and again, what gets me good outcomes for a reasonable cost. There are a lot of possibilities. We're not going to be able to get into all of those. I do want to point out that there was a paper that Gargano was involved with a few years ago where they found that basically pre-annotation didn't necessarily help all that much. I'm going to say here that the devil in the details of the implementation is really important here. It's not to say that that all pre-annotation efforts will be equal, and I usually don't believe any single result I see in the HCI world. I want to see a couple of things that point in a similar direction before I race down that path. So we really would need to do a study, and it's the kind of thing we're hoping to do soon if we can find the resources. I think Brett's going to be showing eHost later. Is that correct, Brett? Okay, so they've put together some of the features that would get towards some of these capabilities. We'll see how that works out, and hopefully we're going to be able to study it soon. I'm going to spend a few minutes. I have a few more minutes here, right? Okay. So what I want to go from now is to really think about some other possibilities that go a little bit further along in terms of what would happen if we really reimagine annotation as a human process. And again, just reminding you of what the goals and the factors are involved here. So what are we going to do for revised workflow? So guidelines, the construction is expensive, this iterative process. The annotator is relying on their memory of it. They may not refer to the guideline, so we don't know how well the guideline is being adhered to in the end, unless we go back and manually review. So what can we do about this? Well, can we integrate the annotation manual in the tool itself? Display the manual right up alongside the annotation facilities. We give help on demand and wizards for some of the complicated tasks to help people through. Maybe that would reduce the training. Maybe we could have some provenance where you would associate with any given annotation the why. Where in the guidelines does it tell me that I should be doing it this way? And can I justify my annotations with respect to the guidelines? Well, how do we do that? We'll get to that in a second. Similar things with this relations. Creation of relations is a bit of a pain in Notator. The displays can be cluttered as we start drawing lines between distant things. Can we help people through this? Can we do pop-ups or drag and drop relations? Can we perhaps abstract out the document where we might show the relations without showing all the text to perhaps give you another view that would be useful for navigation? Adjudication. Again, we didn't spend a lot on this, but can we find some ways to help people understand what they've annotated? I don't know what % of nouns should be annotating the medical record, but if we could give some measure of somebody saying, well, gee, there may be some stuff here you've got to look at that you haven't looked at yet. Maybe we can increase their coverage. I have this is a sort of a flip thing here. Can we have a challenge here of a way to rethink the dual annotation process when we have it to challenge people to compete against each other in a constructive way? Say who's the better annotator and how do you get, again, to higher quality annotations. The comment was made before about how people will remember what they've done. And I think this is an interesting question to ask is can you give somebody essentially the same text multiple times? Not right in succession, but if somebody's spending 8 hours a day, can you give them the same thing to annotate at 3 p.m. that they did at 8 a.m. to see, I'm getting a nod, that's great, thank you, to see how consistent they are? My hunch is that they're probably more than a little inconsistent. So can we develop some internal measures like that might be lower cost than doing full-blown adjudication? I don't know how well these things will work. This is all speculative, but I just think these are ideas worth at least thinking about. Now, we've had on a related project, we've had some interactions with clinicians who really have indicated that they don't think of things in terms of the object with attributes model, that they think more in terms of relation-based annotations. And we had this discussion a couple weeks ago where Wendy mentioned this, and I said, yeah, well, they're right, we're wrong. That's the way it should be. Now, to my mind, that brings up the possibility of saying that, maybe we should have semantic models for all of these things. So if we were to build schema that would allow us to describe annotation guidelines semantically and to describe the annotation semantically, do this all in OWL, we could have rules that would allow us to reason over this guidelines and the annotations to say, are these guidelines consistent? Are the annotations consistent? How well do they match up to the guidelines? And then we can maybe do some possible interface things that would help us look at the sets of annotations to say, I want to look at things from the perspective of subjects, objects, relations. What can I do with this? Now, this is not trivial to come up with this. I think a semantic model of an annotation guideline could be a hard effort, and maybe it's just not possible. But I think it's worth thinking about what we could do here to move this into something more rigorous and structured, and what would be worth doing to try to improve quality output. So I want to just throw a common thing here that I was meeting with some other folks on campus here on Friday talking about the challenge of metadata capture in domains like bioinformatics. Everybody is struggling with this. It's hard. And one of the things that I'm interested in my research is trying to find generalizable approaches that would help both the bioinformatician, the clinical people, and a variety of other people in what essentially amounts to a similar task of taking this unstructured world and making it more structured, where the user interfaces still need a lot of help in that regard. So it's been a lot of fun working on this, on both these projects with the folks here, and particularly with Wendy, and that's all I've got. I'll take that.
Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting talk. I have one comment and then one question. Sure. My comment is actually, you said that you're not so sure about using the pre-annotation to improve the efficiency, or you haven't done that yet. Mm-hmm. But actually, during the sessions yesterday or the day before, there was a paper on that particular topic. Mm-hmm. And also, in fact, we also did a study and published and using Notator to do the semantic annotation. Mm-hmm. And the difference is here, we didn't touch the medical records. Instead, we annotated PubMed queries. Mm-hmm. So actually, we have a poster for later this afternoon as well. So welcome to that poster.
Fantastic.
The question I have is, in addition to doing the qualitative analysis of the annotation tool, can you share some insights how about doing the sort of quantify them? Because you have the usability, you have one slide showing that usability, mm-hmm. that the first line is the efficiency, yep. by tracking the time, yep. which we can do, but then you also have learnability and other things. How do you do that?
So this is a matter of building up the right experiments. So for example, if I wanted to test the learnability of an annotation tool, I'm going to do a little bit of extemporaneous experimental design here. So I'm not necessarily ready to commit to every detail of this, but the general idea would be that I would get a bunch of folks who are relatively novice, either to the task in general or to the tool in particular, and I would give them some materials that would train them on the tool, and that would ask them to see how well they can complete some tasks that would have required a fair knowledge of how to use the tool correctly. Now, I can do this in a couple of different ways. I can do it just with a single tool and a single training mechanism, and then I would get something descriptive out of that. What I would generally prefer to do would be to do something more of a controlled study where I could begin to get at some of the factors that might influence that. So I could have two sets of users with different levels of domain background, but using a tool that none of them had used. to see how does the domain background influence it. I could give them different variants of the tools to compare which tool was more usable than the other, which in the end is probably a more useful question, or more learnable, excuse me. I could also give them different versions of training materials and compare those. So some sort of a study where I try to control some part of the situation, understand what are the factors that may influence how well somebody learns something. That's what I would prefer to do in the ideal case. We don't always have the time and resources, of course, to do every study we want to do, but that's the general model. And similar things with memorability. Memorability is a little bit harder because then you've got to get the same people back after some time length. But you can imagine training somebody to use a tool, having them go through one task on one session, then a week or 2 weeks later, you have them come back and do a separate section without any additional training. And then essentially you can compare pre and post to look at memorability. So there are, of course, answers for all the other things, but that's the general idea.
So I was interested in. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Oh, sorry. So I mean, I have kind of maybe a comment / question. A lot of the tasks that we do are very specific tasks.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we kind of balance this refining a tool when what we're doing varies from study to study? So, you know, one may be very heavy into relationships where, like in co-reference, that's almost all we did was create relationships, and we didn't have to even mark spans or do any attributes, where other things are very attribute heavy or span heavy, or so there's variance within what we do. So how do we kind of make this general for all?
Absolutely. Well, this is why you know, in the limit, what you do is you do narrowly focused modifications and studies that look at very particular subtasks. So I can imagine doing one set of design changes that would look only at the creation of the relations, and I could evaluate a couple of different opportunities, and then I would have some insight into what might work better for creating and managing the relations. That would tell me nothing about the spans and the annotations of the spans themselves. So in the limit, you could really dice these things down incredibly finely. Of course, we don't have the time for that. So in a practical sense, what you end up doing is a study where you find something where you can say, yes, it works well for this particular kind of task, and not necessarily for this other kind of task, or we just don't know about that task because we haven't looked at it yet. Excuse me. Which is unsatisfying, but I'm not really sure what else could be done.
So I was interested in your sort of analysis to try to predict what your time savings might be if you tried this different implementation strategy. And I wondered if you'd thought about sort of extending that to include also the time that it would take to implement. Because a lot of these annotation tasks, right, they do have sort of a time frame, right? And you know, well, they have this many more annotations to do. And so if I'm going to save them this much time implementing this thing and it's going to take me this long, you know, is it worth implementing it in the remaining time?
Well, the problem I would have with that is I don't believe any model of predicting costs of implementation of software. So I would have a hard time believing that you could predict that well anyway. Yeah. I mean, usually with these things, we tend to, I would tend to not count the cost of the implementation. And that may or may not be a valid thing to do, but it is a simplifying assumption that lets me get started.
Yeah, so I think my question is kind of a follow-on because we have a bunch of in-house tools that are created for a very specific task, and they suffer from horrible usability, but we're limited resources. And in general, the return on investing in usability is it grows with how common the software is. This is why commercial software generally has good usability, and in-house
Well, that's debatable.
really bad. But where does specialized software like annotation stand, and how? I mean, is there really a future for something like general annotation software, or is it that every group will still need to always do customized tools with the limited resources they have? Have any thoughts about this?
So I think the question is what's your scope, right? So generalized annotation across a wide variety of domains is probably, that's a very broad topic that I would be hesitant to try to say much about. My hunch is, and by hunch I mean I've got absolutely no data other than a gut feeling here, is that there probably will continue to be enough of a need to extract understanding out of unstructured clinical text that in that world there will be continuing NLP efforts that will continue to need good annotation tools to develop their gold standards for training purposes. So I think at that level, there probably is enough of a need to justify some further effort, and that despite these problems about whether or not somebody's doing co-reference and relations or spanning and picking out terms from the first place, the initial annotations, I think there's probably enough commonality out there that some relatively reusable and relatively generalizable core could be defined that might be something that could be worked on for a variety of efforts. So I think that's certainly a possibility, but I can't defend that with any data.
I've got one quick question that's kind of unrelated. Do you look at the back end of anything a lot? Are you looking totally at the annotator's interface with the program? Or are you looking at also on the back end what the annotations come out and how people use those? I mean, I'm assuming you're more on the front end, but there's also this kind of back end of if you don't have a very robust data model, then what you get out, what you can put in is limited, and what you get out is also hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Well. And I haven't looked at that much in the context of this project, but I think that's definitely a concern and something you'd want to look at. I'm a firm believer that we have to think of any of these problems in terms of systems. And if we have a really usable interface that produces data that's not useful for whatever it happens to it downstream, then as software designers and computer scientists, which I am by training, we haven't really done our job right. I think taking all those things into account is truly important. So we've got to look at the whole pipeline.
Harry, I guess from the commercial side, I guess we've had to do a lot of prototyping as well, which sort of aligns with specialized tools. And I guess one of the things that the investment gets made up front when you are making those decisions about where you're going to be placing buttons and how you're going to be labeling tasks and how you're going to be arranging those tasks. And I guess to what extent can you offer, or can there be usefulness in having any of your developers or any of the teams that are making some of these early tools just to understand some really good basic principles to be able to make sure that when, you know, the 10 hours that they are doing in programming, that UI is going to be as least as best and highly tuned as it possibly could be, and even within with the time frame that they are using.
Yeah, I'm a huge believer in that, both in terms of saying that people developing code that's going to be used by people that will have a front end should have some training in human-computer interaction. I'm also a believer in saying get the developers in front of the users. We don't want to have big walls so that the person writing the code never talks to the person using the system. And I think that's hugely instructive, even if it's done informally. I think that's all well worthwhile. And so ideally, every project would have an HCI expert, and ideally people would hire me for consulting work to do that and all sorts of things like that, right? That's not going to happen in a lot of cases. But I do think that, if you can throw somebody with a textbook and get them to learn a little bit on their own and understand some of the principles, I find it hard to imagine that would hurt. And I think it could help a lot.
Sorry, one last follow-up. I guess, to what extent have you looked at how poor design introduces back-end errors, which sort of plays back into the overall cost of ownership?
Back-end errors. So that's an interesting question. I don't have anything I can say right off the top of my head that I can point to as a piece of evidence. But
you mentioned things like spaces.
yeah,
You
well,
have a tool that's not totally sensitive, you get space errors.
Exactly, that's a fair point. And just the simple thought of trimming off white space at the end of annotation spans should be pretty obvious. And that would be a trivial thing to do with writing a code. But yeah, that's a good point. That led to a lot of adjudication errors that they had a lot of trouble with.
Commercially, what we often have to do is measure bad upfront design to support and maintenance calls at the end. And if you've got lousy stuff up front, it's either not used very well or you're going to need a ton of people to support it.
And there is good data about the general value of investing in usability. That's pretty well established.
Can I get a word in here? I have a question.
Sure, Danielle. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think you made a statement a few slides back about if we didn't have any annotation tools and we threw out what we know, what would we come up with differently? And I think the fact that we have a lot of annotation tools in succession, they're building on the things that they found that weren't, I don't want to say done right, but we didn't understand how to do better, And so you do see this success of kind of progress and new problems as you develop, more complicated schemas and ideas and how to represent them. And my thought was, and it's a silly one, but my phone is awesome, and I interact with it much differently than I did with my last one, which was 10, 15 years ago, old. I get to touch the screen, I can move things. What do you think that the new current trends in technology and changes in usability might have for potential in annotation tools such as Select and Dropbox?
Yeah, so that's exactly the kind of thing that you can think about. So new technologies come in and they change the game. So maybe if you could do your annotations on a tablet and just click and drag and pull things around, maybe that would work better. I mean, maybe what we should do is to turn clinical text annotation into an ambient kind of thing. So imagine a wall-sized surface touch display where a record is continually up on the wall in your workplace, and you could just come by as you're heading off to get a cup of coffee and annotate a term. And no, serious, that may be a little bit frivolous. And I don't want to disparage the work that people have done in terms of learning from the past, but I think at least the hypothetical exercise of coming up with what would you build if you had infinite resources in technology that doesn't exist can be a useful way to avoid getting trapped in what I consider the quicksand of just making incremental improvements that miss the opportunities for really more visionary rethinking.
Yeah. Well, if you build it, I'll be your first user. So
cool.
Thanks.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you.